Capitalist Show, a good buddy of mine. He is one of the smartest lawyers, if not the smartest lawyer I know. He's kind of my go-to guy whenever I have a legal question about what's going on in this insane world we live in. His name is Robert Barnes. Robert, welcome back to the Rebel Capitalist Show.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so you and I go back and forth quite a bit on Twitter with just these draconian measures that are coming down in the United States. And I spoke to Schiff on Thursday or Friday, and he was telling me what's going on in Puerto Rico, and it's just insane. So I want to first and foremost get from a legal standpoint, get your feedback on, is this legal? I mean, what these governments are doing with not only shutting down the businesses, but Schiff was telling me that in Puerto Rico right now, if you're not wearing a mask in public, you could be 100 yards away from anybody. You could be in the middle of the jungle, and if you're not wearing a mask, they'll give you $100 fine. So let's start with the basics. Is that legal?
A lot of this should not be, but what is America's court system and judicial process just has a bad history that in times of crisis, they allow the executive branch to do whatever they want. And so theoretically speaking, all of these restrictions, I mean, really what they're doing is they're doing regulatory takings because they're taking people's jobs and businesses without any compensation of a meaningful kind. And then they're imposing limitations on how you can behave. I mean, I call it medical Sharia law in terms of what you can wear on your face, what you can wear in public, what you can wear in school settings, how you can
actually a great description. I'm going to have to steal that from you.
I mean, the reality is like the veil is actually less intrusive than these masks are. And to give a sense of it, like I have clients that were harassed who actually have disabilities to where even the CDC recognizes they should not be wearing a mask because it will cause them worse health problems. And they should theoretically be protected under the Disabilities Act, but almost nobody's enforcing it. And so they're getting harassed by mobs at stores. They're being thrown they can't even go grocery shopping without being attacked. They can't walk down the street without being attacked. So you have the sort of social mob censorship, private and big companies censorship. Airlines are not allowing anyone to fly, even if you have a health emergency that precludes you from using a mask. They will not allow you on a plane. So if you have a health condition whereby you cannot wear a mask, you cannot fly on a plane in the United States today.
But you're more than welcome to take your Great Dane.
Yeah, exactly. You can take your dog, you can take your social anxiety animal, you can do all of this stuff. But let's say you have an autistic kid that for whom getting on an airplane with a mask is already traumatic, and wearing a mask is particularly problematic for them. It's screw you. You're going to have to get in a car and drive all the way across the country. And if you have some family emergency you need to get to, you can't do it. So these laws should be unconstitutional because they don't meet any of the standard should be that when they're imposing upon you, you have a fundamental right to dress how you want, to clothe yourself as you wish. Any law that imposes on that or restricts that has to meet strict scrutiny, which means it needs to be narrowly tailored to a compelling public interest based on evidentiary standards that meet a high level of empirical scientific evidence. And none of the mask mandates do, particularly mask mandates in public by yourself. The idea that you should wear a mask when you're at the gym by yourself, whether you should wear a mask when you're at the beach or you're swimming.
Outdoors, that's where it's really bizarre. Yeah, you're in the middle of the ocean. There's no one's within 300 yards. You're out there surfing. And
exactly. And they're even telling people they have to wear masks if they've already had tests clearing that they don't have COVID, or they've already had COVID and recovered from it. They're still being required to wear masks. So there's someone who literally cannot be carrying the disease, period, and yet they have the same standards as everyone else. It's really a Milgram experiment in mass social control. How much can the government get away with? How much can they force you to do? And it leads to where else they're going to be going. Because as they've seen their experiment mostly worked, it's sort of like the entire, the way the Fed got set up, the way the tax system got it set up. They initially tested it out. Like a lot of our income tax system is based on, it first went in at the same time the Fed went in, and that was not a coincidence.
Yeah, 1913, yeah.
Exactly. And then secondly, the mass income tax, withholding tax, most of that was put in during World War II. And they called it a victory tax originally, of course. They had better labels back then than just a tax. It's a victory tax, success tax. Maybe Trump will come up with that. He'll call it success tax if he ever does a tax increase. But effectively, that's the mantra and the mindset is how much can we get away with and how much can we do and how much can we seize control from the populace.
Okay, so I know you're a historian and obviously you're an expert in the legal department. I went back just out of curiosity and was reading some newspaper clippings from 1918 when they were battling the Spanish flu in New York. Because I wanted to see, okay, we always think that it's so much worse now than it was when we were growing up, and I get that. I don't want to fall victim to that in my own mind. So I wanted to go back and say, okay, I think it's horrible right now with what we're talking about in Puerto Rico and other places in the United States, but is it that bad? So I went back to the Spanish flu to see kind of some things they were doing back then. They had some similar things that I saw, such as in New York, they banned spitting. So if you're out just walking on the street and the police officer caught you spitting or something like that, they would give you a ticket, just like now they're giving you a ticket if you're not wearing a mask in certain places. But going back to those days, I don't know if you've done any research there. What was it like back then compared to what they're doing now? And what they're, if it's different, is what they're doing now a lot worse in the sense of being more draconian?
So the thing that's similar is they closed down certain big public events. So mass events were mostly closed down. Though it was mostly limited to a few cities.
Yeah.
So a lot of the laws were not statewide. No federal mandates came in like what Biden is talking about. It was just about a dozen cities passed strict laws. Seattle, San Francisco. There was a police officer who shot somebody in the street for not wearing a mask in 1918. So there was some more insane things that happened, which should have been a reminder to not get too crazy now. So they did have mask mandates. They did shut down but for more limited periods of time, mass gatherings. In some places, because the Spanish flu was different than this flu, and then it disproportionately impacted younger people.
Yeah.
They targeted mass gatherings of younger people. They actually did close down universities and schools to a large degree. So some of that is similar to what we're seeing now. What's totally different is they didn't shut down anyone's business. So like New York City particularly just was the most restrictive, and it just restricted when you could be open, how many people could be there, but not complete closures. They never closed all restaurants, never closed all bars, never closed all service industries, never closed down like manufacturing plants. In fact, unemployment went down during the Spanish flu in the United States, not skyrocketing. And that's what's totally radically different, is the economic shutdowns that have taken place across the country. That part is totally new. In the Spanish flu, they recognized that being outdoors was good from the get-go. So a lot of the healthcare facilities are outdoors. You'll see these huge tents set up outdoors. So the mask mandates were similar. Some of the mass gathering indoor shutdowns were similar, but almost everything else is dissimilar. They didn't go, even though the Spanish flu was probably by about 100 times right now more lethal than this flu is, and targeted the most vulnerable. So if you were doing an actuarial table, the life years lost was much more dramatic with the Spanish flu, because it's hit in 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds, not a 75-year-old with 3 comorbid diseases who probably has a 6 month to 1 year life expectancy. So that was the big difference between the two. Now, there was a few judicial challenges, but not many that went up to the Supreme Court.
I wonder how long it took them to reverse those regulations back then. And if my memory serves me right from what I was reading the other day about New York City specifically, I think the Spanish flu came in 1918. It came in first wave. Second wave was in the fall, if I'm not mistaken, and that was the brutal one. And then in the spring of 1919. I think it came back just for a little bit, and then summer of 1919, it pretty much was done. So if I'm getting those dates right, if by the summer of 1919 it was done, did they immediately start to roll back these laws, or did some of them kind of stick? I'm just trying to compare it to like the Patriot Act in 2001, how it was supposed to be this emergency measure, and all of a sudden now, 10 years later, we're still dealing with the nonsense of TSA.
So back then, they really actually did focus on it being a flatten the curve. they didn't think they could necessarily reduce the overall infection or death rate. They just wanted to preclude not being able to have medical facilities. And of course, medical facilities were far worse back
Yeah,
then.
right.
Urban density was far worse. You had 20 people live into a room,
Yeah.
that kind of, but what was also different was it was almost entirely urban based. So it was all mayors making the rules. There were few governors issuing rules. So it was very locally, and this was the way pandemics had been handled really throughout American history until maybe the 1976 flu. It was very much a local determination, local decision. So it was almost always mayors determining issues, not governors, and never the feds. So that part is totally new. And the fact when the governors got involved statewide, that was a early troublesome sign.
Right.
And the fact they were instituting remedies they had rarely done before was a troublesome sign. And the fact that it quit being anchored to flattening the curve. So like National Geographic has done a great long survey of what worked and didn't work based on data and all the different interventions, non-medical interventions used during the Spanish flu. And they found that a bunch of them did work. Others there's less evidence for, but that everything was focused on flattening the curve. They didn't even look at it as, did they stop the flu from even existing? That wasn't even in the consciousness as an idea. And they had 3 different mutations of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu it ultimately infected about a third of the population in all of its incarnations. They say, by the way, it likely started from China too, that it went from China to Europe, and then U.S. soldiers got it in Europe. There's another thanks to us, our soldiers being in places they didn't belong, but and then came back to the United States.
Yeah, wow, that is fascinating. I guess kind of it's easy to get a little down about what's happening right now to personal liberties and the economy. But I guess if you want to look at maybe a light at the end of the tunnel, we did have the Roaring '20s after the Spanish flu. So it is possible. I would argue that the economy now is structured radically different than it was then. And as far as a quick rebound, I don't see that in the cards like it could have been back then because we had so little debt, et cetera. But okay, now moving on to the next topic, something I love talking about, taxes. You ever see that YouTube video about the kid playing Monopoly? I think it went viral. And he's maybe 8 years old, and he just starts crying. His mom was like, "What's wrong?" And he's like, "These taxes! I hate these taxes!" And whatever.
Absolutely right. There's a great one recently where a young African-American kid with his family gets his first ever paycheck, and he's all excited, and he opened up his paycheck in the back, and he just looks, he's so sad, and everybody's laughing because he hadn't figured out the taxes that come out.
Oh, that's great.
Well, what all of this reflects is that what's happening is governments are wanting to seize more and more power and more control, but have less and less economic means to be self-sustaining, and that debt levels are exploding. And I'd been telling people for a decade, clients of mine, I lived in Malibu for a long time. I got out of California about 10 years ago, or at least I put the plans in motion.
You may still be on the hook.
Yes, under the new laws, exactly. These are I don't think they'll be crazy enough to come after me, but because I think there's constitutional problems with it. But basically, what I always tell people is, if your safety net plan is have your assets in the U.S. banks or U.S. controlled jurisdictions, and only have U.S. citizenship, then you have very big holes in your safety net. Right. And there's no better evidence of it than not only what has happened during the pandemic. Americans can't even leave and get into most countries in the world. Often you couldn't even travel between states within the United States, despite the constitutionally protected right to travel between states being effectively suspended. Your right to go to church suspended. Your right to protest suspended, unless it's for the right political cause. Right. Your right to do basic. Your right to go to your job. Your right to operate your own business. The right to use your property as you see fit. All of it's suspended overnight. And the problem is all of these governments couldn't afford this. State governments couldn't afford this at all. There are already massive debt problems, particularly democratically managed states like Illinois, like New York, like California.
Yep.
And so I've been telling friends and clients of mine to get out of California and get out of New York for the last 10 years. and I put my plans myself. I got out and moved to Vegas. Still have legal offices in California, but I decided that you can't stay as a resident there without undue risk and exposure.
For sure.
They're borrowing heavily from the European model of social and cultural life, which is fine, but they're also borrowing the European governmental systems as well in terms of taxation and regulation. And California, I call it California. I mean, basically, they're trying to implement whatever bad ideas the U.S. government has had. California takes those to the nth degree.
Yeah. So talk about this most recent thing. I talked to Schiff about it the other day, but from a legal standpoint, I'd really like to get your take on it. You just see it at face value, and you're like, how can they even? I know it's not a law yet, and maybe they just did it for political positioning or something like that, just to say they're for the little guy and against the rich people. But what's your take on that? And specifically, if you want to outline what the law that they're proposing is and what it says.
Sure. So really what they've done is they're paralleling almost precisely the United States exit tax regime. Like all that's what has a little bit missed a little bit in the legal discussion. When I was looking at this, because I've wanted to bring challenges to the constitutionality of the U.S. exit tax system. And so when I saw what California was proposing, it wasn't a surprise to me that they were going down this route because they need to squeeze money from every place they possibly can.
Right.
The pandemic and their lockdown accelerated that. Like I have clients, I told them, look, I was telling them about years ago, but over the last year, I've been telling them the whatever tax issues exist, don't expect any relief from the audit stage. If you have any issues with the FTB or with the Bureau of the BOE, any of those folks, because the Board of Equalization, because they're going to come after you because they need every penny, nickel, dime, and dollar they can squeeze out of everybody they can.
Yeah.
So this is part of that same thing. So what it is it's a prop. They call it a wealth tax. It's like Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax. It's not a wealth tax. It's a property tax. It just sounds better when you call it a wealth tax. But what it really is a big, huge, massive property tax that it would apply to everybody that lives in California and everybody who has lived in California at some point in the past 10 years.
And it blows my mind. That you can do.
And if you leave California, it will continue to follow you for the next 10 years. And they designed this almost precisely off the original United States exit tax. Because what the exit tax that was always on the book since the mid-1960s, but it wasn't really followed through that much until the Forbes, unfortunately, decided to do a bunch of great cover stories on people who are smart enough to get out of the United States and exit in the 1990s. Well, of course, that caused a political storm, and Congress decided they're going to create and expand the exit tax regime, which is basically it all derives from the concept of sovereignty. So a government's power to tax is dependent on where the property is and who you're a citizen or resident of. So generally speaking, the source of the tax, either property, income, or person, particularly property or person, needs to be within their legal authority. They need to either have in rem jurisdiction over the property that's at issue or you as a person. And so that's always been the constitutional constraint and the international law limitation on taxation. But the caveat to that has always been, can you as a state or a federal government or any government decide to make someone a citizen against their own will? So nobody does this more than the United States. There are people like who say live in Israel or live in other parts of the world who all of a sudden wake up to being subject to, accusations that they failed to file their FBAR because it turns out that they'd always been a U.S. citizen because of some coincidence of their birth, even though they never lived in the United States, hadn't processed that, never questioned a U.S. passport. The U.S. government attempts to unilaterally declare who is and who isn't a citizen. So even though there are certain laws that are supposed to govern that, they claim the authority. The old doctrine under the king was that you could only renounce your citizenship if the king agreed. Otherwise, the king could assert his control over anyone he claimed to have authority over. So it's this old royal doctrine that the American legal system is supposed to be a rebellion against, that it actually incorporates for being able to try to tax people who are not citizens and who have given up that citizenship and who have no property here. So California is looking at that and they're modeling it and they're saying, wow, this would be great We should, because they see everybody's fleeing, and they're like, hey, we should just tax the daylights, especially out of the people that can't even vote here. Who better to tax? It's the old Senator Long joke, the son of Huey Long, who said, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that feller behind the tree. No better thing than to tax the non-citizen, the non-resident who has no voting capacity to influence the election. Right. And that's what they're doing. So and I have no doubts they're going to pass it. It'll likely pass. Oh, yes. California is 2/3 left-leaning Democrat in its state legislative arena and at the governor's ring. And so, first of all, they need money. So any client I've had or anybody I know that has any issues with FTB, the harassment level has gone off the roof in the last month.
What is FTB?
Oh, I call them the mini-me of the IRS. They're the Franchise Tax Board.
Oh, that's
so they're the most aggressive.
IRS, right.
Exactly. And they are even, here's what's frightening for people. In California, they can claim you owe money and seize your assets without ever giving you a hearing, without you even being able to contest the audit, without you even, in some cases, knowing that you supposedly owe a tax. So you may not owe the amount at all. And the U.S. Supreme Court years ago said that's just fine because you can always sue them for a refund later. Like that's supposed to be your legal remedy. They can grab all of your assets, all your property, and they can garnish your bank accounts at any at drop of a hat. They can levy if your assets are within California, they can get them. They can foreclose on your homes, foreclose on your businesses, foreclose on your properties, do discounted sale of your business, so you get double whacked. So let's say they say you owe $100,000 in tax. Let's say they take a property that's really worth $100,000, but they only sell it for $50,000. Guess what? You still owe the IRS the FTB another $50,000.
Wow.
They can the BOE, they can come and lock up your business and shut it down overnight on sales tax related issues. So it's they have crushing power with very few limits or restraints. And this is the whole problem with challenging, is what I always tell people about jurisdictional diversification. If you as a person or your property is in control of the court system of that country, the law can be great. But as they say in Mexico, constitution made of paper, blade made of steel. And the point is that doesn't matter if the courts don't enforce it. And we're watching in live time, even a conservative-leaning United States Supreme Court say that you can discriminate against churches in favor of casinos in the context of a pandemic. So that tells you that if the courts are unwilling to listen to even that issue with a political, just due to the nature of a pandemic, banking on the California court system to give you remedy at the state or federal level is not something you want to do. So the real message of all of these laws is, don't be a citizen of California, don't or at least don't have that as your sole source of citizenship, and don't have your assets in California, or at least have as little as possible in California. And I would say the same is true of the United States and of other Western governments. That if you rely for your citizenship, for your travel, for your residency, for your legal rights on the United States, you are putting yourself at risk and in jeopardy. You don't have a safety net. You have a safety net with huge holes in it. The same is true if you're putting your assets in U.S. banks, putting your assets in the U.S. property, U.S. real estate. Because that can be taken at any time, no matter how good your asset protection plan is. It all depends on a United States judge agreeing with you. Good luck with that. And so now there are constitutional problems with it. They're not supposed to be able to tax people who are not residents of their state, except for property that is within that state right then. Secondly, they're not supposed to be able to tax income within a state, income that was made outside of the state from within a state. And last but not least, there's ex post facto laws. So they're not supposed to be able to apply a law that didn't exist a year ago. So like I left California within the last 10 years.
Right.
They're not supposed to be able to change the laws to me retroactively. And the Constitution does prohibit that. The U.S. Constitution prohibits ex post facto laws and bills of attainder that target people for personal purposes after the fact.
Is the federal exit tax, is that retroactive or?
Yes, in many respects it is. Because here's how it works. I would say kind of. It's retroactive in the sense that it was designed so that it could continue to tax you 10 years after you leave the United States. In some contexts, it could tax you 30 years after you leave the United States. Now, there's been different incarnations of it over the past 20 years. They keep shifting it and changing it. In my view, and in the view of many legal scholars, the exit tax of the United States is, so this is where you compare the two, California and the United States.
Yeah.
The United States exit tax is unconstitutional. So at the federal level, there's limits on what the U.S. federal government can tax. That's why a property tax or wealth tax in the United States, like what Elizabeth Warren was talking about, would always be unconstitutional. Now, the problem is, will you have a court that will recognize that reality? If you have a Democratic majority appointments, good luck with that. They've been absconding. They're not enforcing the Constitution during a scary virus. Our founders founded the country when there were like 8 epidemics going on of different kinds somewhere in the nation in 1776. And now scary virus means we have to wipe out the Constitution for everybody. So that gives you an idea of how unreliable they are. But I plan, like usually for my clients that go through the exit tax situation, I raise it with the IRS and say, I'm really itching to fight this constitutionally and bring it. And what the IRS says is, well, let's reach a reasonable agreement with your client. So they reach a reasonable agreement so that it's worth it for my client not to have to fight the constitutionality of it because he pays pennies on the dollar of what they claim would otherwise be due. Yeah. But the way the U.S. exit tax works, basically a property tax. And the reason why that's unconstitutional is because the federal system uniquely does not allow any direct tax that is not apportioned and uniform. It has to be apportioned between the states.
So what does that mean? Define that, apportioned and uniform.
So in essence, it has to be uniform in how it applies to people throughout the country. Okay. And that's part one. And part two, the bigger problem is apportionment. So the whole background of this is there was great fear during the revolution that led to the Articles of Confederation that there would be a national taxing authority. They wanted there to be no centralized taxing authority. But so the agreement was each of the states would give their share to the national government to make the national government function, with the states having most of the power during the Articles of Confederation time period. That ended up being non-functioning because a lot of the states decided they weren't going to give their share. They're like, no, you give your share. No, you give your share. So that's where the Constitutional Convention was formed. And Charles Beard's economic history of the U.S. Constitution is mostly right. Basically, it was your creditors and your bankers who organized that Constitutional Convention. It was really kind of a quasi-coup because they wanted a centralized army and a centralized taxing authority because that was the only way the Revolutionary War debts were ever going to get repaid. And so a lot of your bondholders were the ones that pushed for the Constitutional Convention, wanting a more effective means of collecting revenue to pay them back. And so where a lot of revolutionary soldiers were not getting their pensions or getting their benefits that they were supposed to. So they create a centralized taxing authority with the possibility of a nationalized army. The check on both of those was supposed to be the Second Amendment. The militia was supposed to be the democratization of armed force so that we would never have a standing national army. And that if you had to nationalize the army, you had to ask the local militia to join. And it's sort of like the jury system. It was a little democratization of centralized force so you wouldn't have a standing army.
Wow.
Of course, didn't quite turn out that way in time, but that was the original constitutional protection. The other one for taxation was they said, okay, don't worry, we won't do any internal taxes. This didn't apply to external taxes, tariffs, et cetera, which was the main source of revenue for the federal government for the first, half century of its formation. So essentially what the federal government wanted to, the local citizenry wanted to make sure that the federal government could not tax one state more than another. Mm-hmm. So that if the federal government imposed any internal tax, the same rate would be paid by a South Carolina citizen for that federal tax as a North Carolina citizen. The second concern was apportionment, which was they wanted to make sure that effectively, even if the tax rate was the same, that the manner of the tax wasn't such that by population, one state ended up paying more per capita than another. And the best context for this is the head tax. In the pre-colonial days, in the old royal governments, the primary method of taxation was a head tax. However many people live in this community, you have to pay $10 per head, if you will.
Mm.
So their worry was they're going to tax me as a person, and one part of the country is going to tax another part of the country. One state's going to tax another. In addition, you also had slavery concerns. This is why apportionment becomes an issue for both taxation and representation as it relates to slaves. The concern with the slaveholders was, I bet the northern states are going to tax slavery right out of existence. So that's why apportionment plays into the 3/5 clause. So all of it was about it was really intended to make it very, very hard to impose an internal direct tax. Today, apportionment is so hard. In other words, you would end up with these crazy tax systems where every state would have a different rate, because in order to get a per capita, the same amount of per capita money coming out of New York as, say, Mississippi, you're going to end up with a crazy number. You're either going to have to way reduce New York's tax, people that New York people pay, and so practically speaking, they can't do apportionment anymore. So that's what happened to the original income tax. They passed an original income tax in the mid-1860s. There was only one prior direct tax, and that was a stagecoach tax that the Supreme Court ruled on back in the early 1800s. But they mostly dodged the constitutional questions by saying it was a tax on activity. It wasn't a tax on property or people. And that being the big worry, that a tax just for existing as a person, a head tax, or a tax on my property that would effectively prevent my ability from profiting from it. And go ahead.
Okay, so I'm totally following that, but then how do they justify? Because if I'm thinking this through correctly, if you've got an income tax that came in 1913, that's going to do the same thing, right? I mean, like
Yes.
what we were talking about between Alabama and New York, where the rates for New York would have to be way, way, way lower to have the same amount coming in per head. So how did they get around that in 1913 with the income tax?
Exactly. So what happens is we pass an income tax during war. Like all wars, it's always a good time for the states to seize more power in 1860, 1864, 1866. But then they scratch it soon afterwards because they were worried about a constitutional challenge to it, because that tax was not properly apportioned. The next time they pass a real income tax, the early 1890s, that goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court says that tax hasn't been properly apportioned. And they tried to make the same argument they had made in the stagecoach case, which they said, well, we're really just taxing activity. We're not taxing a person, and we're not taxing property. And that's what apportionment is about, protecting from taxation. We're just taxing an activity. And the Supreme Court said, no, when you're taxing an activity that's so closely connected to the person and the property, you're effectively putting a burden on the person and the property. You didn't apportion it, unconstitutional. Hence comes the 16th Amendment that says we're going to remove the income tax from the requirement of apportionment. It passes. The income tax law is passed right afterwards. But what's interesting is what happens. They pass one income tax act in 1913, goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1916, and they make a ruling that shocks the congressional class. They say income only means in the Constitution what we were talking about in the 1890s. And you can't expand the definition of income to tax property. It has to be gain separated from the property. If you're taxing the person, or you're taxing the property, then it's still unconstitutional. The income tax only allowed you to tax the gain separated from the property. That is why every income tax since then never refers to the 1913 Act. They pass another law, and every Income Revenue Act passed after that says, in lieu of the Revenue Act all the way back to 1916. That is also why Congress decides they're never going to define income ever again, because they want to stay nebulous. They recognize now the Supreme Court has said there's a constitutional limitation on the definition of income within the 16th Amendment in terms of when apportionment will apply. So Congress decides, well, maybe if we never define the word income, we can't get caught taxing something we're not supposed to. And that's why the word income becomes vague. And that's where the whole quote unquote tax protester movement arises from. They identify the old English principle is you can't tax something unless the who that owes the tax and what it is that's being taxed is defined without doubt. Well, our income tax laws don't even come close to meeting that standard. It would be like if I knocked on your door and said, George, you owe a widget tax. And you'd be like, well, what's a widget? Well, it's where all the widgets come from. You have profitable widgets from other widgets. And you're like, hold on a second. You still haven't defined what widgets are. That's the way our income laws are defined. But what they all recognize is that if they really go to a clear property tax, like a wealth tax, that would be unconstitutional by almost every prominent legal tax scholar. But the reason why they kept income vague is their hope is that someday they could just start to slowly sneak into there. And they do it a little bit with estate tax. They claim that an estate tax isn't a tax on property, it's a tax on the privilege of inheritance, which is completely garbage. And they use the estate tax to create the exit tax. And their theory was this: we as a government we can make you an involuntary citizen of the United States. There's a lot of international legal principles that disagree with that. There are principles dating back to the original states that had constitutions at the time of the Revolution that said you had a right to expatriate to other states. So if you had a right to expatriate between colonies, clearly there's a fundamental constitutional right to expatriate from the United States. That's a fundamental right. That's why many legal scholars say if it burdens a fundamental right, it goes back to that mask discussion, then they have to meet strict scrutiny. They have to show that this law is narrowly tailored to a compelling public interest, and they can't show the exit tax is narrowly tailored to a compelling public interest. So that's the second problem. The first problem is the exit tax is a tax on property. That's the biggest problem with it. But the second one, and it's not apportioned. And then secondly, the other problem is that it's really a tax that is a head tax that's done in a discriminatory manner because it's discriminating you based on your national origin. Because you were once a United States citizen, you have to pay a different tax than a non-citizen who never was a U.S. citizen. And that's a violation of the Equal Protection and Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And it also is a violation because it's not narrowly tailored to any compelling public interest, given that it impacts and severely burdens a fundamental right of being able to expatriate. The same logic, in my view, applies to everything with the California tax, with the exception that they don't have an apportionment provision. But the discrimination provision is still there, and there's a constitutional right to travel. There's a privileges and immunities clause of the U.S. Constitution, means you cannot discriminate between residents of a state when any state imposes a tax on itself. And they're discriminating here, and then they have to meet strict scrutiny, and the exit tax of California does not meet that. Plus, it's an ex post facto law as designed.
Yeah, from a legal standpoint, at what point does the spirit of the law come into play? Like, because if you look at what you were just describing, the income tax and how that came about, anyone, a third grader, could read that and understand the spirit of the law, that you're not supposed to tax property, just period. That's however you want to word it, you're not supposed to do that, as an example. But then the lawyers, the politicians, whomever, come in and just try to finagle around it and put in a cute word here and a cute word there. But isn't everyone, meaning the judges and the people who are making the decisions, looking at that saying, listen, guys, whatever cute word you want to put in there, it doesn't change the spirit of the law. Here's the spirit of the law. Regardless of what you do, we're going to abide by this. Isn't that, where does that come into play, if at all?
It's supposed to. The two other examples I give to people is the likely unconstitutionality of slavery that was argued by Lysander Spooner and Frederick Douglass. That there's actually a very good argument that when they even founded the Constitution, they recognized that if they did not explicitly protect and define slavery within the Constitution under Blackstone's doctrine of the English common law borrowed into the U.S. constitutional law, that meant that slavery was unconstitutional. However, the court system created a great, like all the tax laws that get vague and when they're trying to expand power and unique and get outside of judicial review, those laws are written just like a lot of slavery laws were written, and just like a lot of the civil rights, the lack of civil rights laws are written between 1880 and 1960 in the South. So like there was nothing on the books that said you couldn't register to vote as a black person, just somehow it never happened. Like with slavery was genius. They said, who's a slave? Well, if your mother's a slave. Well, hold on a second. You still haven't defined who a slave is. You haven't defined what slavery is. Well, you can't sue if we tell you you're a slave. So the court said, you're a slave, so we can't decide whether or not you're a slave. Even though the Amistad decision said otherwise in 1840. I had family involved with that U.S. Supreme Court. All of the other courts avoided the issue by saying you can't sue because we're going to presume you're something that you can't prove you're not. And that's what they do with income. We're going to presume it's income unless you prove otherwise. So they take these procedural tricks to effectively help the courts cover up the lack of constitutional authority for certain activity. Same with registering to vote. You basically couldn't sue unless you fit certain legal standards. And it was those legal standards that were problematic in the first place. But because of the nature of them, they presumed you couldn't sue, so you could never get into court to contest it. It was a geniusly corrupt system at how our system maintains the fiction of that we're governed by the rule of law, when realities we're governed by political actors.
Yeah, see,
And
that's the big thing there. I mean, to your point, that this, I don't know if I'd call it genius, I'd call it ethically bankrupt, just for certain gains for certain political groups that have connections. But obviously they're doing it in a very clever way, that's for sure. But I just, whenever I hear, because I'm always talking about having a plan B, just like you're talking about with your clients. And I'd like to get in that in just a moment on how you help clients do that. I think that's fascinating. But when I talk about my own personal plan B, I'm like, yeah, you want to diversify your political risk and your currency risk and all these things, and why not have a second passport? But the pushback I get often in the comments of the YouTube channel or on Twitter is, well, yeah, but here in the United States, we have rule of law. And I'm like, how are you coming to that conclusion? It's almost like it's one of those things that if you say it enough times, like everyone just believes that it's true because everyone's saying it, but there's never any scrutiny. And if someone is actually in the mix, if they're in the trenches like you are on a daily basis, I think it becomes blatantly apparent within weeks, days even, that there is no rule of law in the United States that is exceptional. Let's say that. And I think one could argue that what was the saying that we want to be a country of laws and not a country of men? And unfortunately now, and I think you can attest to this, we're definitely not a country of laws. That's for sure.
Not at all. In fact, it goes back to, I had a debate with my first year law professor teaching criminal law. And we got a debate with me, and he said, look, we want to be, he goes, we're governed by a rule of law, Mr. Barnes. We're not governed by men. And I was like, who do you think writes those laws, enforces those laws, and adjudicates those laws? I was like, at the end of the day, we are always governed by men, and it's only how good those men are in caring about the rule of law that the rule of law itself will matter. Right. And I would say the best part of the American legal system is that it does a very good job keeping most people out of it. And that's how they're able to maintain the mythology of the rule of law system.
Right, because no one has any experience with it. Exactly.
Correct.
It's like being audited by the IRS. People think that there's, like, I've been audited, I don't know if I should say this on YouTube, but I've been audited 5 times by the IRS. 5 times for for 5 separate years. And people that think, well, if you get audited, all you have to do is just abide by the rules, just pay back whatever you owe. No. That is not the way it works at all. And I don't want to get into the nitty gritty there. I probably shouldn't incriminate myself that way. Although I was always right, mind you, I'll go on record. I was always proven right. But yeah, to your point, I mean, someone who's never been audited, they don't understand how it works, that there are no, that's just, you're dealing with a person that's making $20 an hour. And if they want to crush you, they'll crush you regardless of what your bank statements say or how many receipts you have or anything like that. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I think it's hilarious whenever I see these small business owners that are, every single time they run a transaction on their debit card, they're just obsessive compulsive about keeping the receipt. And they'll keep the receipt in that shoebox and everything. And little do they know that they don't care about that receipt. That's never even going to come up in an audit. Even if you get audited, it's just the big transactions and they go right off the bank statement. And then even if you do give them that receipt and they don't want to accept it, they're not going to accept it. So anyway, I'll stop my tangent there. But yeah, if you want to expand on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, no question. I mean, the IRS, anybody who has any experience with the civil or criminal process in the United States in any kind of political case of any kind will discover very quickly that we are not governed by the rule of law. Yeah, we are governed by the rule of men, and mostly corrupt men. And so I defend against, I'll give you an example. The first IRS case that I won that I was a part of was for Joe Bannister many years ago. I was on a San Francisco talk radio station, a bunch of talk radio talking about the case, convincing some liberals to re-question how the tax system works and whether it's really equitable, whether it's really fair, whether these prosecutions really are contaminated. Well, 2 days later, I got a letter to the person I worked with at the time, demanding a full IRS audit and review of my file.
See,
and what was
and then they'll claim that it's random. They'll actually tell your accountant, oh, no, it's random. It's random. Yeah.
But the funny part was the poor SOBs had not spent time to research his name. So the guy I worked for had one name. It was the law offices of this name. But if you'd listened to it on the radio, it might have sounded like a two-person law firm, where his last name had two parts of two separate names. Well, that's what they sent the notice to. They sent it to a law firm that didn't exist. So it was clear that somebody just got it off the radio, was so ticked off, they sent it out. And I've done with it. Every time I've won a big case against the IRS, I know that within the next 3 months, I'm going to get a special love tap. We're going to put you under audit for the last 3 years, 4 years, exactly 5 years.
The first year I got audited, it was literally I had to go back and forth with them for almost a year, for the 1 year audit. Then as soon as that closed, and of course I was right in everything, then like literally 3 weeks later, my accountant calls me up and says, "You're not going to believe this." I'm like, "What?" "They're auditing you again for the next year." And I'm like, how can they do that? And then they audited me again. And anyway, the 5 times there. So anyone that likes to claim that this is just kind of an eeny, meeny, miny, mo, not a chance, not a chance. If you piss them off, they're coming after you, bottom line. And they're not going to stop until they get some blood out of the turnip. That's what ended up happening to me is, although I was right for all these years, they said, well, you owe X. And I'm like, no, I don't, but I ended up having to pay the majority of X, even though they admitted I didn't owe it. And I won't go into the long story. And then finally, when they got something out of me, then they've left me alone. But anyway.
Yeah, when they're smart, if you're really good at what you do politically, when they're smart, what they do is they come up with the right squeeze point. So they figure out, okay, we're going to create risk that's 3 times higher than what could even possibly be due. And if you'll just agree to what we think is due, even though there's a 50% chance that you'll owe 0, there's a 50% chance they get 3 times the amount that could even possibly be due. That even by their allegations are due. And so everybody ends up settling in those kind of cases. Because what people don't know is...
Yeah, almost exactly what happened to me, except with me, what they threatened me with is they said if I didn't sign the agreement to agree to pay XYZ in tax by Friday, and this was maybe a Tuesday, that they would audit me again, and we'd just go right back into this for the next year, and I'd pay another $50,000 or $60,000 in accounting fees.
Exactly. What is they measure your defense cost, and they figure out what your defense cost is, create a ridiculous risk exposure. It's extortion. They just do what the Italian mob did, except they provide less services than the mob did. At least the mob showed up when looters showed up at your door.
Right.
So it's unbelievable. And that's why I give the Nigerians credit. I was like, the way the IRS runs scams with these emergency notices and puts you under great coercive pressure in quick order, the Nigerian scam artists were like, hey, this is great. We'll just say we're from the IRS and we'll get people to send us checks right away, because this is what the IRS does all the time. They send a generic little thing in the mail that terrifies people, and people write checks. And the Nigerian scam is still making money. It's still churning cash just by them pretending to be the IRS. They probably do more good with the money than the IRS does, to be honest about it.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to get your opinion on real quick is I hear so many people that are kind of let's increase taxes and let's do this because it's going to redistribute wealth and everything. And then you hear the IRS always talk about how if people, I don't know the correct or what their wording is, but they're basically saying that people underpay their taxes by like, $500 billion a year or something like that. But what they're doing is they're only calculating what they think people underpaid. They're not calculating all those people who overpaid. And I'll give you an example of a family member. They make a decent amount of money, and they got a tax bill for like $5,000, something like that. And they called the accountant. The accountant says, there's no way we owe this, like not even close. And my family member said, okay, well, how much is it going to take to fight this? And they're like, probably 15, 20 grand. And they're like, well, the bill's 5. And then they just like, they kind of bite their lip and write the check, because to fight it, it's going to cost 20, but to pay it, it's only going to cost 5. So, I mean, how many people out there actually overpay their taxes? And I would take it a step further for all the average Joe and Janes out there who are just running, going through H&R Block or some sort of software program. How many of those people qualify for not just how many people should deduct a lot of things that they're not deducting from their taxable income and just paying it because they don't know any difference? I would say probably 90% of people out there are overpaying just by not understanding what they can deduct from their taxable income. What are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. There's a reason why that H&R Block commercial existed, where he's sitting in that huge baseball stadium and saying everybody in here has refunds that they don't know about.
Yeah,
because
right.
That's the overpayment of tax. Like when I get involved in a civil or criminal case, I often tell the client, who's usually worried because maybe there's something that they think, well, maybe I reached too far here, or maybe I missed this item there. And I'm like, let me tell you the other side of the story. We bring in a forensic accountant every time who's going to look at the deductions that you missed, because we're going to guarantee you. I mean, a bad debt deduction can be a hugely beneficial deduction in a wide range of contexts. In fact, I was one of the first lawyers to win a case that established that you can establish a bad debt deduction even if you're not out of pocket cash, but you're only out of pocket opportunity. And it relates to a wide range of cases, going back to a case called Iowa Southern in the 1960s, which said if a fiduciary deprives you of an opportunity and diverted the cash that should have otherwise come to you, even though you've never paid tax on that, that's actually a fiduciary fraud that constitutes a bad debt under the law that you can take a tax deduction for, because the person who diverted the income has paid tax on it. Right. That is a huge deduction that tons of people have never known to take. Then there's always the theft fraud loss deduction that people don't realize they can take. So those are just two of the biggest examples. People can structure their business to create captive insurance so that they can effectively create self-reserves that are tax deductible proceeds, like every Fortune 500 company does, but almost no small business does. And that tax deduction can cut their tax in half. There's people whose income can go from being ordinary income to being some form of capital gain, and then you shift your tax rate, cut it almost in half. So there's all these mechanisms that people have that the really wealthy, well-connected, big Fortune 500 companies do. There's a reason why Amazon pays zero tax for years. It's because they understand the tax system, and that the tax system's really designed to create incentives to do other forms of behavior more than it is even to gather revenue. As the Fed's been proven over the last... Exactly. As the Fed's been proven over the last 6 months, they don't really need the tax revenues. They can just print. Just keep dealing out that cash. So the tax system is more about social. It's what I tell when people say, "Hey, we should tax the rich more, other people." I was like, "Look, taxes are just are a mechanism of social control, even more than they are at the federal government. State government's a different dynamic than they are a revenue gathering tool. Their primary means, like, people should read a book called Confessions of a Tax Collector. It reads like Lord Conrad going into the heart of the jungle in the Congo. It's because he describes how he goes from being an ordinary everyday guy to basically an insane government IRS tax collector trying to grab some old guy's teddy bear for his daughter as a means of levying the tax debt. He literally took a father's gift to his daughter away from a little teddy bear for the $5 value it had as a means of levying, just because he wanted to punish him. And it gives you the mindset of the IRS that is consumed by it.
Is that a true story?
Yeah, true story. The whole Confessions of a Tax Collector is by an actual IRS employee, and he's basically describing how slowly, steadily he became insane working for the IRS, and how much power. He goes, the intoxicant of power. He was like, I can look at anything in your life, because people don't realize that basically, I've always called tax forms, they're self-confessions. They're the most powerful self-confession forms in the world. You tell the government where you live, who you live with, what your lifestyle is, what your church is, what your party is, what you spend money on, who you're associated with. You roadmap for them your whole life.
Worse than Facebook.
Absolutely. I mean, the old joke with Facebook, is that if you've liked 5 things on Facebook, Facebook knows you well as a casual friend. 10 things on Facebook, they know you as well as a good friend. If you've liked 25 things on Facebook, they know you as well as your wife. And if you've liked 50 things or more on Facebook, they know you better than your wife. And so it's all about information.
Yourself, yeah.
It's why blockchain and Bitcoin are such a threat. Blockchain provides the ability for you to own and control your own privacy, and that's why that's why they're trying to co-opt it within an institutional structure to create digital currencies rather than government-controlled digital currencies rather than cryptocurrencies. They want to benefit from the technology without the opportunities and freedom it affords, much like they did the internet. But that's why in the modern age, there's no, if diversification doesn't exist unless you have political diversification.
Yeah. Okay. So I really like, I know I'm keeping you probably a little longer than normal, Robert. That's really fascinating, because so many people say, well, what difference does it make if the government knows all of my transactions? Like you talk about a digital currency, and if we all had bank accounts with the Fed, I talked to Ron Paul about this the other day, and then the Fed would know, or the government, every single transaction we made. If you're not breaking the law, who cares, right? But I would argue that they haven't been in the system to know the downside there. So what is the downside for the Fed or the government knowing just the average Georgian every single one of their transactions? What if you're not breaking the law, who cares?
Exactly. It's much like the movie Enemy of the State. And what I tell people is, well, often people think, oh, that's the behavior of a criminal if you plan like this in certain ways. And I'm like, no, that's you're preparing as if you may someday be the enemy of the state. Because today the government may say they're only going to define the enemy of the state as a criminal, or yesterday. But today, of course, we're in a country where all of a sudden not wearing a mask makes you a criminal. Right. Trying to open up and run your gym in New Jersey makes you a criminal. Or
just implying there are only two sexes.
Exactly. I mean, anything can get you. A guy got fired for simply making a joke about about the virus coming from Wuhan at the University of Missouri yesterday.
Yeah, then it goes back to a social score. If you don't have a certain social score, then you're not going to get a loan. You're not going to get this. And then if you get down to, let's say, a 0 social score, well, now, bam, you're an enemy of the state. So
absolutely. It's the Chinese social credit system, where if your social credit score isn't high enough, you can't even go on the subway. You can't even leave the city. You can't hop on a plane. You can't go outside your house. So the more information they have about you, the more control they have over you. And anybody can be labeled enemy of the state tomorrow. And ask yourself if this, I always like it from the way I used to phrase it with clients. It was the phrase from the movie Heat, which said, never have anything in your life that you can't walk out on in 15 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. I used to say, well, think of it the opposite way. Have everything already ready in your life that if the heat comes, that you can walk out in 15 seconds flat and get to wherever you need to be and protect it if you feel the heat around the corner. And the way I compare it is, if you're Jewish in 1928 Berlin, it's a great German TV show called Babylon Berlin, you're at the peak of German culture.
All right. So sorry, guys. We just had a technical issue there. It's my internet here on St. Bart's is brutal. We're working on fixing that and getting better internet connection here. But for the rest of this interview, it'll be just audio. So Robert, let's start right where you left off. And you're talking about Germany in the late 1920s, how everything was just spectacular. Art Deco was a fantastic place to live. You really had no reason to be concerned whatsoever. But then we obviously ran into what they went through in World War II with Nazi Germany. So do you want to continue there?
Yeah, exactly. Because if you're Jewish in Germany in 1928, you're at the peak of social, cultural, political power to a large degree for the Jewish community there. It's a burgeoning culture, a successful society. The Nazi Party has run twice before at that point. It has never got more than 2% of the vote. And so you have no reason to worry, no reason to be afraid. And yet within 2 years, your property can be stripped. And within a few years after that, your whole family is murdered. The same is true. You're 1915, Moscow. There were problems there, but nobody could have anticipated that a regime that had lasted for much longer than the United States of America has, multiple centuries, would within 2 years, all of a sudden the entire royal family is killed and executed, and anybody connected to them killed and executed, and their property stripped from them. 1955, Havana. Fidel Castro is seen as just a couple of banditos up in the mountains, nothing to worry about. My Meyer Lansky and Conrad Hilton are spending millions of dollars on hotels there. So that gives you an idea that they thought there was zero risk of exposure.
Right.
Within 5 years, their hotels are gone. And the guy occupying the top floor of the Conrad Hilton's favorite hotel is Fidel Castro. Great suite, by the way. I've actually stayed at that suite, but that's another story. So the whole dynamic of it is things can turn on a dime. As we've seen with the pandemic, it turned on a dime. So if your safety net is solely one political jurisdiction for your property and your personhood, you have massive holes in that safety net that historically have proven to be the most fatal and lethal to your property and your person.
Okay, so let's expand on that in just the last portion of the interview. And I didn't realize this when I first started talking to you several months ago, but a lot of your work is not only with free speech and the taxation issues we were referring to earlier, but also helping people with this plan B type of game plan. So can you expand a little on how you help clients with that, and then maybe some advice for people who have the flexibility to potentially travel outside the United States, but then also some strategies for people who just can't do that because of their job or their family, or maybe they don't have the financial resources to do that right now?
Exactly. So, what I always recommend to people is have a real safety net. And the way to have a real safety net is to have political diversification of your assets as much as you possibly can. And so the part of that is, right now, the utility of second citizenships give you a ticket to other banking jurisdictions, other jurisdictions to own property, other political jurisdictions that can protect your person and your property, and also allow you to travel in a wide range of places. And right now, one of the few upsides to the pandemic and the policy responses to it is that they are at extraordinarily discounted rates.
Yeah,
so you can,
in the Caribbean, they're really on sale. Like St.
you can get,
yeah.
exactly. You can get 2 for 1. You can get even 4 for 1. You can get your whole family for the price of one. And in many cases, they're doing it half price off of that. So something that would have cost, say, for a family of 4, $1 million a year ago, cost $130,000 today. Yeah. That is a massive difference in distinction. Plus, there's other ways you can also invest into real estate and other things, and invest in certain funds if you want to go that path. But and I use a firm out of Switzerland. And what happens is people hire me, and then some people had asked, hey, how do I get in touch with a Swiss firm? They don't want to do any business in the U.S. directly with clients or customers. So what is I'm the legal intermediary, so that they don't have to worry about U.S. jurisdiction, because everybody around the world, frankly, has got terrified of dealing in the U.S. directly because of all the crazy U.S. prosecutions of Swiss banks and the rest. Oh, wow. Once the United States decided they're going to monitor people's behavior anywhere in the world, like the World Cup or like the Swiss bank deals, often transactions that had nothing to do with Americans in some of these cases, then those people don't want to deal with the United States directly. They want to do it indirectly.
And with that, an FBAR too.
Oh, exactly. The FBAR debacle. There's a whole bunch of banks that just decided we're not. There's Swiss banks that were easy to do business with 5 years ago that won't even take you above unless you have the right political connections now. Mm-hmm. The same is true in the Caymans. 5 years ago, you could open up accounts in the Caymans. Now it's very difficult to open up accounts in the Caymans, again, without the right political connections, just because they don't want the headache of U.S. jurisdiction breathing down their neck. And so that's where second citizenship becomes critical. If you have a different passport, you can walk into almost any bank in the world and get an account. And they don't, because St. Kitts and Dominica are not harassing people over their citizenship.
Right.
So all of that is great now for people, and the advantages of it is gives you tickets to different property, different places. It also allows you to get out of Dodge in 15 seconds flat. People should watch movies like Born Identity. Those are built based on reality of how do you deal with potentially becoming the enemy of the state overnight, or for any other reason. If you just simply wanted to be able to travel right now, you needed a second passport. Your U.S. passport can't even get you into Canada. And so if you want to have maximum opportunities and a maximum safety, a second citizenship is the first step on that path. If that's not something you can, and then there's other options that go with that, locating your physical property outside the United States, having legal entities that have ownership outside the United States, having other forms of property outside. Don't have it all in one basket. If all your money is in the U.S. banking system, then the U.S. banking system collapses, you're dead tomorrow. That's what happened to a lot of Germans in 1930. So it happened to a lot of people in the United States in 1930. So
Yeah. And I would go so far too. I don't want to just sit here and pick on the United States. We're no fan of any centralized government. So I'm not saying, and I don't think you're saying, oh, make sure you've got all your assets out of the United States and park it in Switzerland. What we're saying is don't park it don't have all your eggs in any one basket. Don't be held hostage by not just the US, but Switzerland or anywhere. Just diversifying a multiple group of countries, so you're not reliant on just the whims of just one government.
Exactly. My recommendation is, it's like that movie Sneakers, where they're trying to bounce a call and prevent the NSA from tracking their call. In the movie, it bounces off like 12 locations. I've always told people, if you have a real asset protection plan, if you have a real political diversity plan, you're going to have legal ownership or control or connection to entities in a dozen jurisdictions, and you're going to have physical assets you can get your hand on that you can ideally survive for a year, but at least for at least a month, in 5 or 6 different places, that you don't depend on any one banking system, any one financial system, any one political system for your protection and your livelihood.
Okay, so that's overview for someone that's maybe like me with some resources. What about for the average American who is concerned about exactly what we're talking about, but they've got a normal job, they've got a family, it's just not realistic at all for them to get up and move, or even to diversify maybe their assets, because it's all in a 401k, they can't move it, it's in an IRA, it has to be in US stocks or US bonds, something within that jurisdiction. What can they do to at least take some steps to protect themselves?
Every person can have, I call it like a mini born identity briefcase. So maybe you can't have a born identity briefcase that has a couple of passports, that has cash in multiple jurisdictions, that has a lot of those things in it, but you could have a mini version of it. So for example, I would always have a burner phone or two that's never been tracked or traced to you, that doesn't have your name in it. I would have
What is a burner phone, Robert?
A burner phone. I had a client in the alternative product distribution business that called it a bat phone. Essentially it's a phone you can buy off the shelf at different locations that isn't tied to your name. And so what it allows you to do is that it gives you a certain form of security of communication. So like if you were Steve Bannon and you were part of Build the Wall, you probably don't realize the government's targeting you in the whole Build the Wall campaign. And so you're foolish enough to sit there and communicate over a phone they know about. And then I guarantee you they use that for purposes other than that criminal case. They're probably monitoring his conversations with the president once again. But if you want to be able to have protected communications, have a phone or two available to you that can work. Also, the availability of that is you have a phone that has a phone line that's not attached to your name, so that if they shut off your phone or utility bill overnight, like the mayor of LA is shutting down people's utilities to houses he doesn't like their activity in, you want to be able to have a means to communicate with other people without the system being fully aware of it in advance, that means of communication, so that's secure and protected, even in cases of exigency or emergency. The same for, you could have the most secure kind of computer system, a basic laptop, something that's not tied to you, the IP is not tied to you. At least have some amount of cash, so that if you have to get around, or if they come tomorrow and they freeze your bank account and try to destroy your life, freeze your credit cards, you have something available so you can survive for, say, at least a month ideally. So that if you need to hit the road, you can hit the road to communicate, because you never know when you're going to be a target. You can have things like you've frequently recommended, ways to hit the road and survive. So whether that's an RV, or whether that's a small little house on some mountain that's, a $15,000-$20,000 house that has its own generation, that has its own other abilities to be self-sustaining. I like movies like Sniper that are good about this, right? Because here's a guy that has necessarily no reason to worry about the government come someday, but he's seen enough of the government to know that he should be prepared, right? So he's got a self-sustaining little system that has a surveillance and other things set up in ways that are effective, and he can get out of. You don't have to be like El Chapo and build tunnels everywhere, but you should have some mechanism or method or means in place so that you're as protected as possible, more than the ordinary person. So, and there are also ways to limit your track record or limit the ability of the government to trace all your activities. So you can use more secure email communications. Signal, it's a free app. It's open source. It doesn't have any centralized location for communication purposes. So unless they get your physical phone that the Signal communications are on, they cannot get those communications.
Is that like for texting or something? Is that like WhatsApp?
Yeah. But actually, you can call over it too, but for texting in particular, because that's what's stored at a centralized location.
Okay.
What's stored at a centralized location for everybody else's texts is they're stored forever. So it doesn't matter if you deleted, the other side deleted, it's right there for people to look at anytime, any place, any means they want. There are ways basically to protect your anonymity so that you're not constantly surveilled and that your identity is not effectively owned by the state. More use of Bitcoin and blockchain can help achieve that objective as well. So there are ways that are affordable, accessible means for the ordinary person to limit their social footprint and trackable, traceable presence so they can maintain some authenticity of their own authorship of their own identity and control over their own private space.
What do you think of gold jewelry and watches, collectible watches?
Those are always key. So like you look at what has been most successful for people who survived, look at people who survived the Holocaust, how they got out. Those that did get out, how did they get out? What they had were easily transportable, universal measurements of financial wealth. So they had, ideally these days you'd have currency in multiple in multiple locations, some degree of it, doesn't have to be a lot. But otherwise the other effective means is diamonds, jewels, gold, watches. All of that is helpful, as well as your Bitcoin. But as people are seeing, Bitcoin isn't completely secure, and it depends on how you have it as to how its security is, because you see the government seizing it frequently from a wide range of people. But there are ways to make it more secure and more protected.
How are they seizing it? I didn't hear about that, Robert. How are they seizing Bitcoin?
Coinbase and other people like that. So if you have it through them, they can seize it. So Coinbase has given up massive information to the government. There's a current suit pending because Coinbase basically turned over tons of records, just like the Swiss banks did. The Southern District of New York, I believe, is going to start soon spying on people who either donated to build the wall or donated to the NRA. The reason why they're bringing those cases up there, in my view, when there's no real connection to those state jurisdictions meaningfully, is because they want the donor list so they can develop intel and information on them. So if they know you, they control you. The point of Ed Snowden. So the more you can do, the way you can best protect your person and your property is frequently to protect your privacy. And fortunately, there are things like the browser Tor, the Signal app. Ed Snowden has a lot of presentations on other, burner phones are useful for that. All of those, having a sort of a flat laptop you buy at a pawn shop that has no prior ties to you, that you never use until you have to, things like that. So there's no trackable, traceable record to you, but preserves your ability to communicate, preserves your ability to move around, preserves degrees of your privacy. All of those are effective means. And then, like as you said, one of the most effective means to be able to hit the road quickly whenever you need to, whether it's rioting and looting, pandemic problems, political issues, whatever it may be, is to have an RV. And that's an affordable, accessible means by which people can achieve some degree of physical independence in an unstable government.
Yeah, good. Great points, Robert. Yeah, man, I could talk about this stuff all day long. So just on a personal level here, how good is it, or how great of a strategy is it for your personal security and your personal privacy to have a YouTube channel that gets 1.5 million views per month where you talk about this stuff nonstop?
Exactly. I told people early on, I was like, doing the high profile cases I did, I knew I was going to be subject to constant harassment by the IRS. And I just factored that into the equation. I was like, it's par for the course. In fact, I don't even mind, because the way I put it is only a stuck pig squeals. So when the IRS comes whining after me personally, that means I know I really achieved a really great outcome for the client in the last case.
Yeah. All right, buddy. Well, for my viewers and listeners who want to find out more about what you do or what you do with your show or your law firm, where can they go?
Yeah, so people can find the law firm at barneslawllp as in Peter.com. and they can follow me on Twitter at Barnes_law. And that's where I make a lot of social media political. Well, the way I use it is as an internal curational tool for my own library of thoughts and ideas. And I just let people get a sneak peek of that through the Twitter feed.
Okay, very cool. And I know you're in Vegas. I'm probably going to be in Vegas sometime in September to visit my mom. So I'm going to take you to dinner, and it's on me. As long as we can go to Cat. Is that still in the Palazzo?
Yeah, yes, it is. And I think they're doing at least, I would say book early for whenever you think you're going to be here, because they're doing the weird social distancing thing. Like all the good restaurants are like packed on weekends.
Oh, I didn't think about
I mean, like not really packed, but they're all, you can't get in.
all booked. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll get us reservations there. That's my favorite
Perfect.
steak place in town, and hopefully that's acceptable for Mr. Barnes.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic.
All right, Robert. Thanks again for your time, and I cannot wait to do it again.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.